In this video, I want to discuss more muscles of the head and neck, but I want to focus on the neck region. The neck region has muscles that move the head. It also has muscles that are important in depressing the mandible and in swallowing. The first muscle I want to talk about is known as the sternocleidomastoid muscle. The sternocleidomastoid muscle comes from the sternum and the clavicle, and it passes from a very anterior portion on the thoracic wall along the lateral margin of the neck to insert on the mastoid process of the temporal bone, hence the name sternocleidomastoid. Sternocleidomastoid muscle functions to extend the head at the atlanto-occipital joint, but yet flex all of the cervical vertebrae. So the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Next, I want to point out another structure on the model which divides what we call the suprahyoid muscles and the infrahyoid muscles. This is the hyoid bone. So it's easy to see why suprahyoid muscles, muscles above the hyoid bone, and infrahyoid muscles, muscles below the hyoid bone. If we look at the suprahyoid muscles, we can see there are actually 3 or 4 different muscles depending on how you want to view it. The first muscle I want to discuss is called the digastric muscle. Di means 2, gaster means bellies, so the digastric muscle has 2 bellies. The anterior belly has origin off of the internal aspect of the anterior mandible. Then the digastric will run posteriorly, and it will run through a connective tissue loop on the hyoid bone and then pass back to the mastoid process. So we have the anterior belly of the digastric, and we have the posterior belly of the digastric, going back to the mastoid process. It is important to note that this muscle does not attach to the hyoid bone as an insertion point, but rather goes through a connective pulley loop on the hyoid bone. So it does function to lift the hyoid bone during swallowing, or if the hyoid bone is fixed in its position, it will function to depress the mandible. If we remove the anterior belly of the digastric, which we cannot do on this model, we see a muscle immediately deep to that known as the mylohyoid. It comes from the mandible and goes into the hyoid bone. The mylohyoid. The mylohyoid also functions to elevate the hyoid bone during swallowing, or if the hyoid bone is fixed, it will help depress the mandible to open the mouth. Deep to that mylohyoid, we have another muscle known as the geniohyoid. The geniohyoid also comes from the mandible, the internal surface of the mandible, to the hyoid bone. And like the mylohyoid, it functions to either elevate the hyoid bone during swallowing or depress the mandible if we want to open the mouth. There's one more of the suprahyoid muscles that is very visible on this model. It is called the stylohyoid muscle. The stylohyoid muscle, as its name implies, comes from the styloid process and goes to the hyoid bone. This muscle functions to elevate the hyoid during swallowing, but does not have any function in actual depression of the mandible. So those are the muscles we call the suprahyoid muscles. The anterior and posterior bellies of the digastric, the mylohyoid, the geniohyoid, and the stylohyoid. Let's take a quick look at the infrahyoid muscles. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 infrahyoid muscles. Infrahyoid muscles function to pull the hyoid down. We want to pull the hyoid down to fix that hyoid so that the suprahyoid muscles can then depress the mandible. The first muscle I want to talk about in the infrahyoid muscles comes from the sternum, which we cannot see on this model, and passes up to the hyoid bone. This is known as the sternocleidomastoid muscle. The sternocleidomastoid muscle. Deep to the sternocleidomastoid muscle, we have a muscle coming from the sternum, but it does not go to the hyoid bone, it goes to the thyroid cartilage. This is known as the sternothyroid muscle. Sternothyroid muscle. If we look at just the thyroid gland or thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone, we have a muscle that goes from the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone. It is called the thyrohyoid. So the naming is very straightforward. sternum to hyoid, sternohyoid, sternum to thyroid, sternothyroid, thyroid to hyoid, thyrohyoid. We have one more muscle anteriorly. It's coming from the first ring of our trachea. The first ring of our trachea is called the cricoid cartilage. It is immediately below the thyroid cartilage, and we have a muscle that runs between the two called the cricothyroid muscle. Cricothyroid muscle. Only one muscle remaining in these infrahyoid muscles. That is known as the omohyoid. The omohyoid muscle has a superior belly and it has an inferior belly. And we cannot see on the model, but the inferior belly is coming from the scapula, and as it's passing posterior to the sternocleidomastoid, it passes through a connective tissue loop and takes an angle change and then angles up to the hyoid bone. The omohyoid is an important muscle in helping to anchor the hyoid bone so that we can open the mandible. So those are the supra and infrahyoid muscles of the neck. The next set of muscles I want to talk about in the neck are located up underneath the mandible, and they are actually for movement of the tongue. And there are three of these muscles I would like to talk about. One of them comes from the anterior surface of the mandible inside and goes to the tongue. It is known as the genioglossus muscle. The genioglossus muscle is mostly used for protruding the tongue or sticking out your tongue. From the hyoid bone up into the tongue, we have the hyoglossus muscle. The hyoglossus muscle pulls your tongue in and down. Pulls your tongue in and down, or back and down. And then coming from the styloid process into the tongue is the styloglossus muscle. The styloglossus muscle pulls the tongue up and back. So these are extrinsic muscles of the tongue. Muscles that are not in the tongue, but muscles that do move the tongue. The genioglossus, the hyoglossus, and the styloglossus. We have three remaining muscles that I want to point out on this model. These are called the scalene muscles, and we can see them best on the left side of this model because we have removed the sternocleidomastoid and some of the other infrahyoid muscles. There is an anterior scalene muscle, a middle scalene muscle, and a posterior scalene muscle. The scalene muscles come from the transverse processes of C1, 2, 3, and 4, and they insert anterior scalene into the first rib, middle scalene also into the first rib, posterior scalene will insert into the second rib. Now these muscles are fairly important for movement of the neck. They also assist in elevation of the rib cage during labored breathing, but they make an important anatomical landmark. There are a few nerves associated with them that help us to learn the muscles. There is a nerve running vertically across the anterior surface of the anterior scalene. That nerve is the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is actually going to the diaphragm, the muscle that separates our thorax from abdomen and is used for breathing. This is an anatomical constant. The phrenic nerve is always found running over the anterior surface of the anterior scalene muscle. Notice also on this model that the anterior scalene and middle scalene came from the same origin. They have an insertion on the same rib, the first rib, but not the same spot. That leaves a gap between the anterior scalene and the middle scalene muscle. In this gap, we will find the nerves of the brachial plexus, leaving the cervical region of the neck so that we can go out to the arm. Brachial plexus, nerve supply to the muscles of the upper extremity. So that covers all of the muscles that we expect that you would know on this model, both A and P1 and human anatomy. Many of the muscles presented will not be covered in A and P1. Most will be presented in A or in human anatomy.